This video is brought to you by Squarespace. 1 year ago, Netflix released their adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Together, we've covered a handful of adaptations on this channel, and we've also covered the original Avatar. We know what makes the original show so great, and we know what makes a great adaptation. Given what we know, what went wrong with Netflix's Avatar? And why have so many adaptations gone awry these days? Well, in this video, we're gonna figure this out by diving deep into the many facets of how this show disappointed. We're gonna take a look back at the production of the series and look at some of these early seeds of disappointment that were planted. We'll look at the state of adaptations as a whole. We'll examine the characters of this show and how they are subpar versions of the original. And we'll wrap up the video by looking at the reception of this adaptation and see what hope there is. So let's travel back in time to 2018 and look at the production of Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender. Development on Netflix's Avatar began all the way back in 2018. Entertainment Weekly broke the news that the series would be given another attempt at a live-action adaptation. A piece of concept art was shared to the public, along with the revelation that the original series creators, often referred to as Mike and Brian, would return as showrunners and executive producers. This was a big deal for Avatar fans, because no matter how much fans loved the original series, the cloud of the M. Night Shyamalan film would always hang over this new project. But one of the major reasons that movie failed was because it had absolutely no respect for the source material. No one from the original production was involved with that movie, and M. Night clearly did his best to put his own spin on the project. Since the original creators of the show would be returning for the Netflix adaptation, any worries that the show would be faithless should have been quelled. Production was set to begin in 2019, and fans were excited. Unfortunately, however, this excitement didn't last too long. On August 12th, 2020, Variety broke the news that both Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko would be leaving the project. These kinds of things happen all the time and for a variety of reasons. But what was stunning was what Mike and Brian had to say following their exit. Both creators went to Instagram and released a statement. Michael DiMartino had this to say: "When Brian and I signed on to the project in 2018, we were hired as executive producers and showrunners. In a joint announcement for the series, Netflix said it was committed to honoring our vision for this retelling and to supporting us on creating the series, and we expressed how excited we were for the opportunity to be at the helm. Unfortunately, things did not go as we had hoped. And who knows, Netflix's live-action adaptation of Avatar has the potential to be good, but what I can be certain about is whatever version ends up on screen, it will not be what Brian and I had envisioned or intended to make." Strong words from Michael DiMartino. Brian Konietzko had this to say: "When Netflix brought me on board to run this series alongside Mike 2 years ago, they made a very public promise to support our vision. Unfortunately, there was no follow-through on that promise. Though I got to work with some great individuals, both on Netflix's side and on our own small development team, the general handling of the project created what I felt was a negative and unsupportive environment." Those last 5 words, "a negative and unsupportive environment," was what stuck with me right away. This instantly soured fans on the project, and you would have been right to have thought about the M. Night Shyamalan film. Regardless of Mike and Brian's departure, development on the series continued. Roughly a year later, in August 2021, Albert Kim was brought on as writer, executive producer, and showrunner. Kim had this to say after the official announcement: "Throughout this process, our byword has been authenticity. To the story, to the characters, to the cultural influences, authenticity is what keeps us going, both in front of the camera and behind it." These are some pretty big words to come from Albert Kim, especially since a year ago, the original creators of the show had left for what felt like a lack of authenticity. Netflix gave the team behind Avatar a budget of roughly $120 million, which would amount to $15 million over the course of 8 episodes. While casting the leads for the series, Kim reiterated his commitment to staying faithful to the Asian influences, both in front of the camera and behind it. In August 2021, the main cast was announced. The rest of the cast was filled out as well, with notable actors such as Daniel Day Kim and Paul Sung-Hung Lee brought on to play Ozai and Iroh respectively. What surprised fans, however, was the casting for Azula, Mei, and Ty Lee, characters that were not in the original first season. Production of Avatar began in November of 2021 and would run for 7 months, wrapping in June of 2022. Say what you will about the authenticity to this story, what you can't deny, however, was Netflix's commitment to the aesthetics of the show. For the most part, everything from the character design to the sets to the locations, it all does look and feel like Avatar. Unlike some shows that have come out in the past year, the budget of Avatar does not feel lost at all. What pleased me more than anything was the commitment to the look of bending. There was a lot of behind the scenes material showing the amount of preparation and training the cast and crew did to make bending as cool as possible. Like the original show did, the bending in Netflix's Avatar took heavy inspiration from real martial arts, something I feel was translated well to the screen. Marketing for the project began towards the later half of 2023. In the summer of 2023, the first look at the series was revealed, showing us pictures of Aang, Katara, Sokka, and Zuko. A few months later, in November, the first trailer for the series was released. A lot of people, including myself, began to get excited for the show. It looked and felt like Avatar. Netflix also made the wise decision to have the original cast of Avatar help market the show. The cast can be seen on multiple occasions doing press with the new cast, wishing them the best on their new journey. During the press, Albert Kim in a string of interviews made some rather questionable comments about the series, making a comment saying that they want to mature the show a bit so fans of Game of Thrones can enjoy it too, changing Katara's character because of gender issues, and of course removing Sokka's sexism because it was too dated. These comments come across as tone deaf to a lot of fans. Regardless, on February 22nd, 2024, Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender was finally released, almost a full 6 years after its initial announcement. While a lot of the production was really cool, clearly some early cracks started to show. It doesn't matter how much the cast and crew spoke highly of the original. What Mike and Brian said during their departure spoke louder than anything. Now, before we dive deep into the contents of season 1, it's important that we take a look at the entire industry as a whole. So let's take a look at the state of adaptations and how that relates to Netflix's Avatar. Adaptations are littered throughout the current state of movies and TV shows. A handful of these adaptations I have personally covered on this channel. I've covered book to movie adaptations, like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. I've done book to television adaptations, like Game of Thrones. Superhero movies are loosely based off specific comic books, so I think it's fair to call those adaptations. And I've even done video game to television adaptations like The Last of Us or Arcane. What you will notice, however, is that with the exception of my initial review of Netflix's Avatar, I have never covered an animation to live action adaptation. Why have I never done this? Well, because I loathe these types of adaptations so much. Some of my favorite stories ever are animated works. My favorite movie ever is an animated movie. When a studio comes out and says, we want to adapt this animated movie into live action, you're basically telling me that animation is an inferior form of storytelling. You're telling me that a viewer cannot truly appreciate a story unless it's in live action. In 2017, I saw the live action adaptation of Beauty and the Beast, and even though the movie wasn't awful, I told myself I would never watch an animation to live action adaptation again, because I don't want to support this type of content. To this day, I have not seen any of these live action movie remakes. The Lion King, The Little Mermaid, Mulan, Cinderella, Aladdin. I have not and will never watch those movies. Why on earth would I watch the live action adaptation of Mulan when the original and much better animated movie is available on the same streaming service? Now you may question, why would I support any kind of adaptation? Why specifically am I so against animation to live action? Adapting a book is totally warranted. Watching a movie and reading a book are drastically different experiences. When something is being adapted faithfully, usually it is done with the purpose of introducing the story to a new audience. Not everyone has the time or interest to read a book, unfortunately. So watching a movie adaptation of that book is a valid adaptation. It took me weeks to read Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. That's a big ass book. It only took me 2.5 hours to watch the movie. There's also a lot that goes into a book to movie adaptation. Actors, music, sets, cinematography. These are new elements that are not possible to experience in the original story. Video game adaptations are a fairly different medium as well. I would love to play the Last of Us games, but I also don't want to drop $400 on a PlayStation, $60 on a game, and spend 20 hours playing the game. Instead, I just watched the HBO series, and while I know it's different, I still really enjoyed the story. When you're watching an adaptation of an animated work, you're watching the same thing but with real people instead of cartoons. There's no new experience here. There's no new revolutionary take on the source material. It's the same damn story, and often worse. If someone came to me and said, should I read the Lord of the Rings books first or watch the movies first, there's a discussion that could be had. The books dive deeper into the lore and the characters more than the movies ever could, but the movies have excellent music, acting, effects, stuff that can only be seen on a screen. Even if the books are better, watching the movies is a totally different experience. If someone came to me and said, should I watch the animated or live action version of Avatar, why the flying fuck would I tell them to go watch the live action version? The animated version is literally better in every single way, but the live action version shows real people. If this actually matters to you, if you refuse to watch an animated story but will gladly watch the live action version, guess what? You're a prick. I don't judge people who watch these adaptations, by the way. I get wanting to re-experience the original story in a new way. It's just not for me. So after watching that Beauty and the Beast movie, for 7 years I upheld my vow to never watch one of these adaptations again. But of course, fate had to test me when they announced an adaptation for one of my favorite shows ever. And the marketing really got me hyped.
That's rough, buddy.
So I fell for the grift and decided to watch the adaptation. Honestly, I didn't hate it at first. There was clearly passion behind the project, and I have no choice but to respect that. The show was also leagues better than the movie, so I felt compelled to give the show props for that. I also saw the way the kids spoke about their show and their characters, and I wanted nothing more than for them to succeed. These kids are awesome. I love them. Their energy is infectious. But I also need to be real with myself. After a year and now rewatching the show on its own merits, my opinion has drastically soured. Now, other than my moral qualms with animation to live action adaptations, why do these types of adaptations struggle so much? Despite looking and feeling like Avatar, despite having big fans of the animated show working on this adaptation, why does it still struggle? Well, stories are complex. If you have a well-written story, a bunch of factors tie into what makes it a well-written story. Storytelling's like a house of cards. Everything should matter. If you remove one card, then the whole house can crumble down. When it comes to an adaptation, more often than not, there are some minor things that will be excluded. Not per se because the writers are clueless, but because there may be time or episode constraints. Sometimes you may be adapting a 20-episode season of 20 minutes each into an 8-episode season of 50 minutes each. When a writer is adapting a story, they may know they need to include X, Y, and Z, but they might make some minor changes or alterations to X, Y, and Z, and now they no longer serve the same purpose to the story as the original story did. This is one of my main points in last week's video where I covered Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Plotlines or scenes from the book were included in the movie, but they were altered just enough to where the plotline or scene lost its original purpose, and as a result, you get a plotline or scene that doesn't improve the story. This issue is littered all throughout Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender, where the same story beats happen, but they happen in a slightly different way where the original meaning is lost. What I'm going to do is go through the 5 most important characters in the show. We'll discuss how the overall plotline for each character is the same, but also how certain elements are lost in the adaptation that now make it a weaker story. Let's begin by talking about Aang. Aang in this show appears to be the same as his animated counterpart, but when you actually look at his arc this season, he's not the same person. Remember, the point of this video is to show how things are lost in adaptation. This could be specific scenes or plot lines in the original that are completely non-existent here. This could also be scenes that were translated here, but completely lost their initial meaning or impact. Or maybe the biggest one, characters will treat each other like they're talking to their animated version, but based on the events in the live action show, it doesn't make sense for the characters to act this way. So when the series begins, it begins in the past. We see Aang's relationship with Gyatso, we see the genocide, and we see Aang frozen in the ice. This still happens in the animated show. In theory, I don't mind the reshuffling of this sequence, putting it in the beginning of the show, that is. There's a way where you can make this sequence just as effective as the original, but again, the adaptation has lost some of that original meaning. We learn about Aang and how he ran ran away in the 12th episode of the original series. This was over halfway through the season. At that point, we had really gotten to know Aang. We've seen his personality, and we've also seen his flaws. When we see the airbending masters treat him unfairly, since we've grown to care about Aang, we feel really bad for him. In the Netflix show, however, we have just met Aang. We see him flying around and having one conversation with Gyatso. At this point, we aren't invested in Aang or his struggles yet, so this scene comes across more as an exposition dump rather than a key part of Aang's development. Small difference, but it matters. In both animation and live action, Aang is supposed to be this goofy kid, right? Well, in the animated show, we see him on multiple occasions being that goofy kid, like at least every other episode. In the Netflix show, how do we learn this? Aang exposition dumps to Appa and that's it. I'm a goofy kid who likes to play with my friends and I don't want the responsibility of being the Avatar. See the difference? In one show, we see Aang be a goofy kid, and the other he just says he is. This first episode is really bad at this. It tries to cram in a lot in this first episode, and by doing so, characters just say their character traits without actually showing them. This is an awful way to do an adaptation. The writers know that Aang needs to be a goofy kid, but they just tell us he is instead of showing us. Now, of everything I'm going to mention in this video, this next point is the biggest mistake the series made. So in both shows, Aang gets trapped in the storm, is frozen in the ice, and disappears for 100 years. So this is a faithful adaptation, right? Wrong. In the animated show, Aang ran away because he was terrified of the responsibility of being the Avatar. Instead of confronting his fears, he ran away. This is a character flaw, something the Netflix version doesn't have. Because in the Netflix show, Aang doesn't run away because he's scared. He goes on a quick fly because he needs to clear his mind. This decision has so many drastic consequences. For one, it takes away his biggest flaw, his inability to take his role as the Avatar seriously. But also, as we'll come to learn, Aang's arc this season heavily ties into his guilt of not being there for 100 years. Everyone chastises him for running away, but he didn't run away. He just got caught in the storm while he was trying to clear his mind. This is so bafflingly bad. I often say on this channel, characters must suffer the consequences of their actions. Both versions of Aang's do this, but animated Aang's actions stem from his biggest flaw. Netflix's Aang's actions stem from a reasonable thing someone would do. Which story do you think is more powerful? Which would actually lead to more character development? Clearly the animated version. This is the worst example of a plot point being adapted, but not adapted properly. So Aang wakes up from the iceberg, and he learns about what happened in the past. This happens in both versions of the show. But how does it happen? In the animated show, Aang goes home and finds all the airbenders dead. This sends him into a fit of rage. In the Netflix show, Gran tells Aang this as an exposition dump, and he only seems mildly upset. When I was 12, if someone told me one of my loose friends died, I would have been devastated. My dog died when I was that age. I was a mess. When Aang was told not only that everyone he knew is dead, but he was also told his entire culture of people were brutally murdered, and he's like, oh no, this stinks. Which version of this plotline do you think works better? The one where the character has a visceral reaction to this information, one that's devastating to him, or the one where he finds out through an exposition dump and seems mildly inconvenienced? Which one also makes us feel bad for Aang, something that is a big part of his story? This first episode is a disaster. So the episode ends and we get the moment where Aang enters the Avatar state in a fit of rage. This happens in both versions of the show. But let's take into account the context surrounding both. In the animated show, Aang just found out everyone he knew is dead. He enters that fit of rage, and Katara is there to take Aang out of it. Aang might have lost all of his people, but he now has a friend that is going to be there for him. In the Netflix version, he already knows everyone is dead. He just sees it for the first time. And Aang pulls himself out of the Avatar state after almost killing Katara and Sokka. One version helps build the relationship between these characters, and the other sets up how Aang needs to be terrified of his powers. Which do you think better serves the character? I would argue the animated version. This misunderstanding of scenes and sequences continues on throughout the whole show. I need to be clear, it's not that it's different that makes it bad. It's just that what changes is objectively worse. The second episode is the Kyoshi Warrior episode. This happens in both versions of the show. Why is Aang here, however? In the Netflix show, Aang needs advice on what to do, so he seeks out an island named after a previous avatar so he can get advice. This is a smart and mature thing to do. In the animated show, Aang goes to Kyoshi Island so he can play with a giant sea monster. This makes makes him quite immature. At the end of both versions of the episode, the Fire Nation attacks because they find out Aang is on the island. Aang has to learn that danger will follow him and he needs to be careful. Which version do you think conveyed this message more effectively? Which version do you think will lead to more character development for Aang? The version where Aang made a smart and mature decision but danger followed, or the version where Aang acted like an immature little kid and as a result danger followed? I would argue the animated version. Shocker. In the next episode, Aang meets up with Teo and the Mechanist. This happens in both versions of the show. In the animated show, Aang was initially pissed because these people found refuge in the Northern Air Temple, and they were not respecting Aang's culture. Aang went on an arc where he had to learn to accept things are different and these people weren't disrespecting airbenders. In the Netflix show, Teo wants Aang to fight the Fire Nation, and this makes Aang uncomfortable. That's it. Same plotline, two drastically different narrative purposes. The funniest example of this is when Aang meets Ko later on. In the original show, Aang couldn't show any emotion because his face would be stolen. In the Netflix show, there's no reason for him to be emotionless. Netflix Aang is acting like animated Aang here, but that's not what the story set up. I don't want to go through every single example, we'd be here for hours, so instead I want to transition into Aang's character traits. The writers of the Netflix version probably watched the last episode of the series where Aang refuses to kill Ozai, and they interpreted that as Aang being a total pacifist without a single backbone. For some reason, Aang is totally scared of the power he possesses. He sees getting stronger as a bad thing. He doesn't want to fight, and every time he does fight, he apologizes. Fine, it's a different direction to take the character. You know, Aang being a bit more worried about his power could be an interesting arc for him. But in pursuing this arc, they made Aang such an unlikable character. I feel bad saying that about a 12-year-old kid, but it's true. Sure, in the original series, Aang was a bit passive at times, and sure, he didn't revel in violence, but you know what else Aang did? He stood up for himself, he gladly fought his enemies when his friends were in trouble, and frankly, he did a lot of morally questionable things, like when he took that letter away from Sokka and Katara. Netflix Aang has no backbone and is always preaching to the choir. Anytime he's in any situation, no, please don't hurt me, we gotta do what's right, I need to help my friends, Commander Zhao, please let me go, I can't let the world down again, Zuko, don't capture me, what's wrong with you, why were you born this way? I wouldn't mind this once in a while, but I also remember in the animated show Aang trolling Zhao after he burned down his boats. I also remember him telling Zhao he would gladly fight him. These moments are completely lost from the character in the Netflix show. God forbid Aang not be the perfect godchild he is in the Netflix show. Now, the biggest change to Aang's story in the Netflix show is that he has a clear arc in season 1, kind of. They set up that Aang doesn't like fighting, but they also set him up to feel really guilty about being gone for 100 years. All these mentors tell him that he needs to become powerful and he needs to do it alone. This contradicts Aang's worldview. It's not a terrible setup for an internal conflict, so where does this end up going? Well, in the penultimate episode, after talking to Kuruk and hearing the same spiel for the 4th time, Aang tells Katara he doesn't want her fighting. Okay, that makes sense. A few scenes later, after Katara fights Pakku, she tells Aang that it's not his choice and that she's going to fight. Aang's like, okay, and then in the beginning of the next episode, Aang is fighting the bad guys with his friends. What's the point of his arc? Where's the conflict? Where are the consequences of his flaws? Where the writers were likely going with this was at the end of the season. After an entire season of conflict, Aang decides to merge with the Ocean Spirit where he is told he will be lost forever. But after hearing Katara's speech, he realizes how important his friends are and he leaves the Ocean Spirit. Now, if you're thinking that is a total misrepresentation of events, you would be completely correct. For one, it's not revealed Aang could lose himself forever with the Ocean Spirit until right as it's happening. That's a terrible way to set up stakes. When Aang is fighting all the Fire Nation ships and Katara is doing her speech, it's not her speech that takes him out of it, it's the fact that the Moon Spirit returned. I'm not convinced Aang even heard Katara. She is softly talking and Aang is hundreds of yards away. After this happens, Aang is like, okay, I love you guys, on to season 2. This is not an arc. There's no climax to this struggle Aang had. When did he ever suffer the consequences of his flaw? When did he learn that the mentor's advice was not great advice? It was terrible. Aang's story and his character is almost nothing like it was in the animated show. And that's because the writers failed to adapt Aang properly. Now, speaking of failed adaptations, let's talk about Katara. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 16.5% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Of all the characters in Avatar that were adapted the poorest, Katara has to be at the top of that list. Katara shares very few of the same qualities that made her so complex in the original show. The shortest way to describe Katara's change in the Netflix show is that they removed all her agency. Remember, even though most of her story is adapted, so much of the context is lost. We can see so much of this in the first episode. I mentioned before how the shuffling of the opening to the series could have worked, but one thing it does is it shifts the perspective of the opening events. Since we follow Aang in the past and then is reawakening in the future, we take away the element that Katara was kind of the protagonist of these first few episodes. People remember the classic opening monologue, the thing that was shamelessly repeated by Gran Gran in the Netflix episode. But people also seem to forget that in the pilot episode, this monologue is a bit different. Yes, Katara narrates it, but it's not just an exposition dump. She talks about herself and her hope that one day the Avatar will return to save the world. This scene transitions to her and her perspective before they break the iceberg. In the Netflix show, they take this monologue and give it to Kyoshi. Her relevance to the narration is irrelevant. They probably just chose her because she's the only female Avatar. So a little bit of character development is lost, but nothing that can't be made up. The opening sequence in the original show features Katara trying to waterbend, but after she screws up, Sokka makes a sexist comment which results in Katara getting pissed. Through her anger, she breaks the iceberg, and then once she sees that there's someone inside, she runs over and completely breaks the iceberg to let Aang out. Yeah, we know Katara having any sort of passion or anger is lost in the Netflix adaptation, but this agency is also lost with Katara. She saw Aang in the iceberg and proceeded to break it, while in the Netflix show, she does it by accident. Another instance where a little bit of character development is lost. The Netflix first episode covers roughly the first 3 episodes of the animated show. If you compare both, yeah, the same things happen for the most part, but what was lost in the adaptation? One of the most offensive things the Netflix show did was take one of Katara's most important storylines and they gave it to Sokka instead. Sokka and Katara have a very interesting dynamic in the beginning of the animated series. Sokka sees himself as the leader of the tribe, but in reality, he has no clue what he's doing. As Katara says, he's just playing soldier. Katara, on the other hand, had to step up and take on a lot more responsibility for someone her age. She does the stereotypical mother duties like cleaning, but most importantly, she's the emotional anchor of the tribe, something that she brings to Team Avatar. There's a wholesomeness to that because her empathy and compassion is an admirable trait, but there's also a tragedy in that because she's just a kid. There's this moment where Aang and Katara are sledding, and she says she hasn't done that since she was a kid, while she is still a kid. This nurturing and caring part of her is fully on display in the Southern Air Temple episode. While Aang is goofing off and playing around, Katara is concerned with how he will react to learning the truth. When he enters the Avatar state, she is the one who is there to calm him down. This is a key part of her character, that she's the one who can calm him down when he's in emotional distress. I mentioned this before. While the Avatar state rage is still in the Netflix adaptation, all the meaning for Katara is lost. None of this storyline of Katara having to grow up too fast is present in the Netflix adaptation. Instead, all of that is given to Sokka. In both the Netflix version and the animated version, Katara gets a scroll that helps her learn waterbending. But how did she get this scroll? She went out of her way to get the scroll, even stealing it from those pirates. That's agency. She went out of her way to get something she wanted. In the Netflix show, she was given it to her by her grandmother. What did we learn about Katara here? That she likes waterbending. In the animated show, we learn so much more about her. I know this isn't the case, but it feels like the writers looked at animated Katara, they looked at all her character traits, and chose to develop the most masculine trait, and that's her wanting to fight. I bring this up because of the quote Kim said about there being some gender issues with Katara. He doesn't go into specifics, but it feels like what he meant by that is cutting away all her feminine traits, and that's such a shame and kind of offensive. Wanting to fight is her only characteristic in this show. 90% of Katara-focused scenes are about her wanting to become a better waterbender in some way. It makes her a one-dimensional character. Why does Katara tag along with Aang on this journey? Sure, a big reason is because Aang suggests the two of them could go to the Northern Water Tribe to learn waterbending, but also part of it is because she cares about Aang, and she feels like she has a duty to help save the world. That makes her a multi-dimensional character. She has multiple reasons for what she's doing. In the Netflix show, she joins Aang solely because he helped her with her waterbending. It comes across as a little bit selfish, to be honest. I want to transition to the third episode, because the stuff with Jet is a prime example of the writers writers thinking they are dealing with animated Katara when they are not. In the original Jet episode, Katara is clearly enamored with him. Sure, she has a little crush on Jet, but most of her intrigue stems from what Jet is trying to do. He is successfully fighting off the Fire Nation, something that she wants to do. But after learning that Jet is willing to hurt innocent people to fight the Fire Nation, that's when she turns on him. This kind of plays out in the Netflix show, but again, the context is different. She meets Jet outside Omashu and she instantly has a crush on him. When he shows up again, instead of telling her friends that the man they are staying with is a Fire Nation spy, she follows Jet into the forest. Why does she follow Jet? She doesn't know about his freedom fighter crew. She follows him because she has a crush on him. The biggest thing is the turn against Jet. Hot take, what Jet tries to do in the Netflix show is not the worst thing ever. He's trying to kill a Fire Nation spy and a king he deems incompetent. We haven't met Boomy yet, so we don't know what he's like. Katara instantly judges Jet as some terrible person, when in reality, he's doing things that are rather common in war. Now, I'm not trying to argue for political assassinations, by the way. What I'm saying is that in wartime, it's not the most ridiculous thing in the world. Jet is not some reprehensible person in the Netflix show. He's not trying to kill innocent people, but Katara treats him like his animated counterpart. I'll get to more examples of this in a second, but I want to ask you guys this. Does Katara have any underlying story here? Is there an arc or a theme trying to be conveyed? No. In the 5th episode of the season, Katara enters the spirit world. There she relives the memory of her mother's death. The flashback of her mother's death happens in the 3rd season of the original show. Not putting that here isn't a problem at all. What is the problem is that there is nothing accomplished by her or Sokka's flashback scene. Wan Shi Tong tells Aang that by entering the spirit world, they will be forced to face an uncomfortable truth about themselves. But that doesn't happen. Katara and Sokka just relive old memories, they were captured by Ko, and then freed by Aang. On to the next episode. What was the point in seeing these flashbacks? You may argue that it provides context for Katara's trauma. Fair, but not really. All season up to this point, Katara has spoken about how her mother's death has held her back, so seeing it happen here doesn't tell us anything new. The reason the scene was shown in the animated version was because the writers wanted to contrast that scene with the scene of her confronting the killer later on. In the past, he was a Fire Nation soldier, and here he is a pathetic old man. That's why we saw the flashback. So this is another example of the writers not understanding why something happened in the original show. We need to wrap up my section by talking about Katara's waterbending progression. In my original review of the show, I spoke about how Katara in the animated show did make progress in her training rather quickly, so I didn't mind that here. While I do stand by that a little bit, her progression is way more earned in the animated show. Part of that has to do with the format of the shows. The animated show has a 20-episode first season, and there's a presumed time jump over the course of almost all the episodes. In the Netflix show, there are only 3 time jumps, after episode 2, after episode 4, and after episode 6. So even though the total runtimes are roughly the same, it feels like more time passed in the animated show because of the implied time skips. The most glaring instance of this is what happens after her confrontation with Paku. After that happens in the animated show, Paku apologizes, the episode ends, and when the next episode begins, Katara is much better. Again, a time skip really helps here. She actually spent time training with a master. In the Netflix show, she has her fight with Paku, and then immediately afterwards, the battle begins. Katara never actually trains with a master here. She just fights him once, and now she's a master. The master terminology bothers me more than anything. It's totally undeserved. They took Zuko's line of him saying, "You found a master, haven't you?" and Katara saying, "Yes, you're looking at her," is an undeserved brag. It makes us not really like her. What they did with Katara was kind of depressing. They took this rich and interesting character and they turned her into someone who only cares about fighting. Let's move on to the other Water Tribe sibling, Sokka. Sokka is not a character that was as poorly done as Aang or Katara. The writers understood the basic foundation for Sokka's character, and that's his insecurities in trying to be a better fighter and leader. But of course, this is Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender, so some things were lost in the adaptation that makes this version of the character much weaker. We learn in the 5th episode of the show that Sokka's insecurities stem from disappointing his father. So throughout the series, whenever he feels like he isn't a good enough warrior, he sees that as affirming his father's father's belief. Sokka's insecurities in the animated show stem far deeper than just disappointing his father one time. The pinnacle of Sokka's trauma stemmed from being left behind by his father. He was left behind with all the women and children, and because of that, he not only sees himself as weak, but women and children as weak. Therefore, he tries to overcompensate to try and make himself seem like a great leader. So animated Sokka is more concerned about his entire identity, while Netflix Sokka is just concerned with being a warrior. That does limit his character a bit, but it's not the end of the world. As a result of this change, the entire season for Sokka pretty much focuses on his relationship with being a warrior. Where the issue lies here is the writer's inability to give Sokka any sort of arc. Yes, he's insecure, but that doesn't lead to any meaningful change. From the beginning of the season to the end of the season, Sokka is pretty much the same dude. The writers believed that by adapting certain plot lines from the animated show where Sokka does change, they assumed that would also mean he grew and changed in the Netflix show. But that didn't happen because this is not a great adaptation. Let's start with the Suki episode, because this is where most of the controversy resided. Albert Kim famously said that they removed Sokka's sexism arc because it felt dated. This has been discussed repeatedly. I have nothing really to add, but what I will say is the issue is a lot more than just Sokka's sexism. The writers didn't just remove that part of Sokka's story, they removed every other flaw Sokka has as well, except for his one insecurity about being a warrior. The opening episodes of the animated show play Sokka off as a complete goofball. He gets embarrassed over and over again, and no one takes him seriously. Yes, this is mostly because the writers wanted Sokka to be the comic relief character, but what it also accomplishes is a great opportunity for Sokka to grow. In the Netflix show, Sokka is not a terrible leader. The tribe does take him seriously, and he's even able to hold his own for a bit when fighting Zuko. He doesn't win obviously, but he isn't totally embarrassed. This was done because the show wants to be more mature. Okay, but what's the consequence of that? The Suki episode. What was the point of the original Suki episode? It was for Sokka to be humbled. He shows up completely overconfident and embarrasses himself. Afterwards, he humbles himself, goes to Suki, and asks for training. Yes, the girl part of it was definitely important to the episode, but it was more so about Sokka being humbled than anything. The episode had an arc for Sokka, and since he was so incompetent and goofy in the opening 3 episodes, this episode allowed him to grow in a substantial way. In the Netflix version, what was the point of the episode? There's no point for Sokka. He doesn't grow here. If anything, Suki has a little bit of an arc, which is fine I guess, but you're taking away from Sokka's development. When the two first talk, Suki is pretty rude to Sokka unnecessarily. In the animated show, she was rude because Sokka deserved it. He disrespected her. In the Netflix show, all Sokka did was say they're both warriors, so Suki comes across as a bitch. Anyway, the two both show off their fighting skills and Suki is a much better fighter. As a result, Sokka is like, oh, she's a better fighter, I want to learn from her. And the two spar and they're clearly crushing on each other. After they fight, the episode ends and Sokka is the same dude. He didn't learn anything or go on an arc. Did he become a better warrior? Maybe, but that's not an arc. Sokka wanted to become a better warrior, he saw someone who was a better warrior, and he asked to learn from her. What's the lesson there? What's the theme? How are Sokka's insecurities challenged? No lesson, no theme, no challenges. So much of this avatar is no story, just plot. Suki has a story. After meeting Sokka, she has stronger aspirations of helping out the rest of the world, something that could very well tie into her reintroduction in season 2, but again, they ignored any development for Sokka. The next episode was the Jet and the Mechanist episode. How did the original Mechanist episode develop Sokka? Sokka helped create the hot air balloon, but he also put that into practice and he saw how effective it was. This gave Sokka confidence and showed the audience that Sokka is a lot more capable than we previously thought. In the Netflix version, Sokka helps the Mechanist with the hot air balloon, but that's it. He doesn't see it put into practice at all, so there's no growth for Sokka. He doesn't gain confidence. Yeah, the Mechanist tells Sokka he should be an engineer, and Sokka is like, no, I'm a warrior. But we have yet to see this plot line pay off, so we'll just have to wait until season 2. But until then, no story, just plot. When it comes to the Jet storyline, the writers seem to completely miss how important the original episode was to Sokka. Sokka initially was jealous of Jet, but in the end he proved to be the better leader. This was a key episode of Sokka's development, but instead, the writers took the Jet storyline to only develop Katara, not Sokka. Shocker, the writers adapted something, but they completely misunderstood why that something was a part of the original story. The cave episode developed Sokka and his relationship with Katara a bit, but that was more relationship building than Sokka Sokka progressing along his arc. By the time we get to the end of the season, there's no arc for Sokka. He had lessons from Suki, the Mechanist, and Yue, but they haven't materialized into anything yet. I'll bring up the same point about Sokka's flashback that I mentioned with Katara. Sure, it was cool to see, it fleshed out Sokka, but did it change him in any way? No. This moment is completely ignored in the final few episodes. Sokka's character arc is currently in standby. These lessons about being a warrior or being something else could pay off in the future, but we'll just have to wait and see. The most disappointing part of Sokka this season is not that his arc didn't materialize, it's that he didn't change at all. An arc doesn't need to happen in one specific moment. It could be gradual, like Sokka's development in the animated show. So while Sokka wasn't butchered like Aang or Katara were, his story did leave a lot to be desired. It's time to talk about something a bit more positive, so let's move on to Zuko. But before continuing on, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform for anyone who wants to stand out online or start a business. Whether you're a content creator like me, or someone who wishes to start their own movie blog, Squarespace is perfect for you. If you sign up today, you can poke around and explore Squarespace 7.1 and see what it's capable of. You can use its new Design Intelligence AI to create any type of online presence, and it will have its own cool and unique identity. Use it to build your own beautiful page that will capture your audience in a way only you can. If you're looking to build your own store because you're passionate about a product you wish to sell or you have a wonderful idea, you can use Squarespace payments to manage all your earnings in one place. You can set a variety of different prices, tiers, paywalls, all of that. Pretty much anything that will give your customers their best value. If you're a YouTuber like me and you wish to upload special behind the scenes videos or extended videos, you can do that as well. Frankly, Squarespace is perfect for any creator wishing to expand their brand. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Again, that's squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Zuko was the character that was adapted the best. It's really hard to screw up Zuko's story, so I'm glad they didn't manage to do that. Since Zuko is a villain, the writers have no choice but to give him flaws. You can take every flaw away from the main trio, but they're still good guys. With Zuko, you just can't do that because then you don't have a villain. I will say this though, Zuko's introduction was terrible. Talking about spelling out all your character traits in the first scene. Uncle, you know I must find the Avatar so I can restore my honor because my father banished me. It was pathetic writing. But besides that, they nailed his character. Zuko in season 1 is a really angry and insecure kid. That's hard to mess up. They devote a lot of time to developing his relationship with Iroh, which is another key part of his character. When I look at all the Zuko storylines in season 1, I ask myself what was the intended purpose of the original and does it translate over to the Netflix show? For the most part, they do. Why does Zuko forego his chase of the Avatar to rescue his uncle? Because his uncle really matters a lot to him. And deep down, Zuko's a good person. What is the point of Zhao this season? Not just to pose as an antagonist to Zuko, but to give Zuko the opportunity to show how important restoring his honor is. That was the entire point of the Blue Spirit episode. Zuko was willing to risk his life just so he could have a chance of restoring his honor. This translated over to the Netflix show nicely. The only thing I could argue that left a little more to be desired was Zuko during the battle in the end. Part of Zuko's storyline was that his determination to capture Aang can lead to some very serious consequences. He would have died if not for Aang. That's not in the Netflix show. He just fights Katara and then he leaves. Now that's not a big thing that is missing from Zuko's story, so I don't hate it. The most interesting part of Zuko this season are actually the things that happened in the past. I love the additions of the flashback scenes with Iroh and Zuko. The basis of their relationship is that Iroh feels like he failed his own son and he doesn't want Zuko to go down that same path. Showing Zuko during Lu Ten's funeral and having him sit by Iroh was really touching. The scenes where Zuko is getting ready for his first war council also show how kind and wholesome he was before his banishment. It contrasts nicely to the angry Zuko we see in present day. Since Iroh knows what Zuko was like before his banishment, and we see that, it would make sense he would want to help Zuko find himself again. These scenes absolutely work and are excellent additions to the show. The 41st Division scene was also an excellent addition, but it's not like it changes Zuko's story. He advocated to save them for sure, but it's not like he asked for them to be his crew. So it's a great scene, but not really relevant to Zuko. Where I'm the most conflicted with Zuko is his relationship with his father. Most people were discussing if Zuko fighting back during his Agni Kai was a bad thing. That beat isn't too important to me. I would have preferred he didn't fight back, but it doesn't take away from the scene. Where I struggle a bit is with Ozai's attitude towards Zuko. At the end of the season, Zhao tells Zuko that there is no way he could have ever returned home because his only purpose was to motivate Azula. Now, every other scene we get with Ozai, he seems to actually care about Zuko. When he banishes Zuko, I am under the impression he does it because he genuinely wants Zuko to learn his way of thinking. Even when he is burning Zuko, it seems like it's something that he doesn't want to do. The reason I struggle with this is because in the animated show, Ozai's abuse towards Zuko is really heinous. Ozai didn't banish Zuko because he wanted him to get better, he banished Zuko because he hated him and he saw him as a weak child. The absurdity of fighting Zuko because he spoke out of turn was the point of the scene. Ozai was looking for reasons to get rid of Zuko, and there he had his reasons. He sent Zuko to find the Avatar because that was seen as an impossible mission. Now, is the child abuse in the Netflix show still present? Absolutely. They just toned it down from a 10 out of 10 evil to an 8 out of 10 evil. But overall, they did a good job with Zuko. If anything, most of the changes they made were net positives for the character. Let's conclude the main section of this video by looking at Azula. Azula is maybe the most emblematic of the peculiarities of this adaptation. As we know, Azula was not in Season 1. She showed up in Season 2 where her impact was instantly felt, so including her in Season 1 of this adaptation was a bit peculiar. Even with including her, she's still not an integral part of the plot of the season. Sure, she schemes with Zhao, but frankly that is a minuscule part of Zuko's storyline. This then begs the question, why include Azula in this season at all? It's clear that the motivating factor is how the original series resolved her character. There are a handful of critics, including myself, that say in the original show, Azula's descent into madness happened too quickly. For most of the series, she was seen as the perfect evil child, and all that unraveled in the span of just a few episodes. By including her here, they clearly want to illustrate her insecurities. She's concerned that her father will grow to appreciate Zuko now that he's found the Avatar. She's also just really insecure about how her father sees her. She clearly needs to be the best and the strongest firebender in the world, or else she will be seen as a disappointment. Sure, we see her cunning and her strategic mind, something that is definitely a part of her original character, but it's the insecurities that are important here. When we first meet Azula, we aren't shown any of these insecurities. She is a villain through and through, a serious threat to Zuko and Team Avatar. The argument I've seen a lot of people make is that by showing Azula as flawed and insecure this early on, it will take away from her impact as a villain come Season 2. People aren't at all upset with how Azula was depicted here. Most fans acknowledge that had we seen Azula before Season 2, she would be somewhat like this. It's just how it affects the threat the character poses. This is the only instance of an adaptation change where I simply cannot judge it yet. We know what the change is, but we don't know how it will impact the story. All video I've discussed changes that were made to the characters, the outcome of that change, and how it was adapted well or adapted poorly. With Azula, we know the change, but we don't know how that change is going to impact the story, because the key part to Azula's story hasn't happened yet. It felt important addressing Azula because her inclusion in the season is a big change. It's also somewhat emblematic of the Netflix writers thinking they can somehow improve on the source material by making changes, but we need to be fair and not criticize every change just because it's a change. So for Azula's character, we'll just have to wait and see. Will the writers understand the purpose behind her story, or will they miss the mark like they did with Aang, Katara, and Sokka? Let's wrap up the video by looking at the reception of Netflix's Avatar. Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender scored a 61% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 71% audience score. On IMDb, the season scored a 7.2 out of 10. The highest rated episode on IMDb was episode 6, titled Masks, with an 8.2 out of 10, and the lowest rated episode was episode 4, titled Into the Dark, with a 7 out of 10. On March 6th, 2024, Netflix's Avatar was renewed for not just a second season, but also a third and final season. A month later, Albert Kim stepped down as showrunner of the series, with new showrunners taking his place. As of February 2025, filming for Season 2 is currently underway. So, what do you think about Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender? Do you think there's hope for the series? Do you think Season 2 will fix the mistakes of Season 1 or continue those mistakes? Let me know down below. Tune in next week where we'll take a break from the years later videos and look at Marvel on Disney Plus and how it's been kind of a disappointment. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to tonight the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.